Welcome to today's presentation, which consists an introduction to case studies of sexual harassment in team sports. By the end of this presentation, attendees will understand the meaning of different terms related to harassment and abuse, realize how behaviors of harassment and abuse manifest in the world of sport, familiarize themselves with studies conducted regarding harassment and abuse in sports, get informed about initiatives taken in Europe regarding the issue of harassment and abuse in sports so far, and get informed about high-profile cases of abuse in sports across Europe. The sexual realm of human experience is closely associated with many social taboos. Therefore, whilst sexual behavior, disposition, and orientation perhaps represent the most intimate and profound expressions of a person's identity, they can also represent an aspect of significant vulnerability for all individuals. This may especially be the case for those who are already subjugated through organizational or social attitudes and practices, through armed conflict, or as a result of not conforming to culturally dominant models of sexual behavior. Over a decade ago, Peter Donnelly claimed that sports organizations had behaved as though sexual abuse could not possibly occur in the pristine world of sport. However, during the past 2 decades, a number of researchers have drawn attention to the problem of sexual exploitation and abuse in sports, and the impact of those endeavors can now be observed at an international level. Whilst large-scale prevalence research into sexual harassment and abuse in sport is sorely needed, studies show that this is a problem that affects many athletes. For example, a study conducted in Australia revealed that 31% of female and 21% of male athletes reported experiencing sexual abuse at some time in their lives. This was a survey where 370 participants, of whom 160 were male, participated. Of these, 41% of females and 29% of males had been sexually abused within the sports environment. And a recent report by Child Helpline International underlined that organized sports and recreational activities are also significant settings where abuse takes place. The language, terms, and definitions used to describe and explain negative interpersonal sexual behaviors and experiences across international boundaries and in different cultural contexts can be confusing. The many definitions relating to sexually violent and/or exploitative behaviors tend to place emphasis on the perpetrator and/or the victim, whilst ignoring wider social factors closely associated with this problem and its prevention. Therefore, in establishing the parameters for the problem and this that we need to address, it was considered important to define the problem in comprehensive terms rather than focusing on the narrower frame of individual acts. This also reflects the underlying aim and scope of this program, to articulate ways to prevent rather than simply to depict the problem of sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports. The main terms used are adapted from the Norwegian Olympic and Paralympic Committee and Confederation of Sports in 2010, as well as from the Norwegian Gender Equality Act, and are defined here in this slide. Harassment relates to unwanted attention or conduct, the violation of dignity, and/or the creation of a threatening, hostile, intimidating, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment. Abuse implies that a person's rights are violated or infringed by another. This is based on an abuse of power and trust. Gender-based harassment means unwelcome conduct related to a person's gender that has the effect or purpose of offending another person's dignity. Sexual abuse means to trick, force, or coerce a person into any sexual activity. The person does not want or is not sufficiently mature to consent to. Sexual harassment refers to behavior of a sexualized nature which is unwanted. It can be characterized as exploitative, degrading, coerced, forced, and/or violent. Such behaviors may be verbal, non-verbal, and/or physical. The examples of verbal harassment and abuse include unwanted or degrading intimate questions relating to body, clothes, or one's private life, jokes with a sexual innuendo, and proposals or demands for sexual services and sexual relationships. This may also be in the form of unwanted telephone calls, letters, SMS, text messages, or any other communication with a sexual content. The non-verbal examples of harassment and abuse include staring, gestures, showing pictures or objects with sexual allusions. The examples of physical harassment and abuse include the unwanted, unnecessary, or forced physical contact of a sexual nature, such as pinching, pressing oneself onto the body of others, attempting to kiss or caress another person, sexual penetration, and even rape. Although such conduct is understood to be frequently manifested through individual behavior, it is closely associated with collective values and established social power relations. Regardless of the specific form such behaviors take, it often has a damaging impact on the person who experiences it and can result in negative long-term consequences both for individuals and organizations. For the sports community, it is important to consider not only that perpetrators may be attracted by the unregulated access that sport often provides to children and maybe vulnerable adults, but that its specific structures, values, and cultural practices might also generate conditions conducive to the abuse of power and trust and the manifestation of sexual and gender harassment and abuse. The perpetrators of sexual harassment, violence, and abuse are overwhelmingly male, and research has noted that all male hypermasculinist environments that are widespread within sport are particularly conducive to the exploitation of women and children. Furthermore, sport frequently involves close relationships both among groups of athletes and between individual athletes and their coaches or their leaders. According to Women's Sports International in 2004, the trust that develops between athletes and leaders is often regarded as an essential part of training for success. Essentially, the perpetrator, who is already in a position of power, may seek to establish a relationship with the victim which appears to be built on trust and mutual objectives. This can create a situation where the victim is unable to resist sexual advances, which are then escalated to the point where the victim may feel that they have consented to the sexual activity and that they are responsible for it. The sexual activities then become even more confusing and even more difficult to resist. It appears to be easy for more powerful individuals, whether seniors, peers, or coaches, to take advantage of those with less power, using demeaning, sexually harassing behavior such as sexist jokes or unwanted touching, or in the most extreme cases, abusing them sexually, emotionally, or physically. This may especially be the case in contexts where there is little or no awareness of human rights, of equality, especially children's rights, and the lack of opportunities for groups to engage in decision-making processes. Therefore, whilst sexual and gender harassment and abuse cut across all social categories, penetrators are overwhelmingly those in position of social, cultural, organization, or situational power, and victims are overwhelmingly those in a subordinate position in relation to the perpetrators. As such, some social groups may be particularly vulnerable to this form of human rights violation, especially where there is an absence of codes of conduct and professional standards. A number of researchers and international organizations have put much effort in exploring the problem and offering recommendations and guidelines on how to address this issue at various levels. Our knowledge on the incidence and prevalence, prevention and control of sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports has been enriched since researchers started publishing empirical and anecdotal data on this topic in the early 1990s. Qualitative interviews with female victims of sexual abuse in sport have highlighted a series of risk factors related to the victim, for example, younger than the perpetrator, or a lack of a strong relationship with their parents, or that the perpetrator might be older than the victim or in a position of significant power, and the organization may have no codes of conduct or clear reporting procedures. There have also been qualitative studies on male victims and the impact of policy, as well as the case studies of sexual abuse. There have also been quantitative studies on the prevalence of the sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports, which have been undertaken in a number of European countries, including Denmark, the UK, the Czech Republic, France, Greece. These studies have reported significant incidents of sexual and gender harassment and abuse in the realm of sports. Thus, a study of elite female athletes in Norway revealed that 28% of the sample had been sexually harassed and or abused in a sports setting. Similarly, a study in the UK reported that 29% of the sample of athletes representing all competitive levels had been sexually harassed, while 3% had been sexually abused. The first calls for attention to the problem of sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports appear to mainly concern girls and women in sports. Today, however, it is acknowledged that this problem concerns both genders, and most studies inside sports settings have surveyed elite female athletes' experiences of sexual harassment by a male perpetrator. They may be a coach or a peer athlete. Some studies have included both male and female athletes. Besides, the empirical study by Harthill in 2009, cases of sexual harassment among male athletes appear to be an under-researched area. There is also inadequate knowledge about same-sex female harassment. And since the phenomenon of sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports is underreported for both male and female athletes of all levels, of all ages, there is a great potential for more research in this area in most European countries, and particularly in those with no past scientific documentation of the problem. In parallel with increasing knowledge, a number of international organizations and political structures have developed directives and recommendations on how to address the problem of sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sporting environments. The corresponding recommendations are going to be presented in brief and in a chronological order. In 1994, the Women's Sport International Organization published the first information brochure on sexual harassment, which ended with guidelines for what should be done to help prevent sexual harassment and abuse in sport. Recommendations included implementing codes of ethics and conduct for coaches, no matter whether they work with adults or children, fostering thus a climate of open discussion about the issues of sexual harassment and abuse, adopting athlete and parent education programs which inform and advise athletes on their rights and how to maintain their integrity and autonomy, and putting into practice rigorous screening procedures for the appointment of all sports personnel. In 2004 now, 10 years later, the Women's Sport International again produced the first ever position statement condemning any form of sexual harassment exhibited toward female athletes. In the recommendations offered for minimizing the risk of sexual exploitation in sport, the Women's Sports International position statement suggesting such actions as adopting harassment-free policies and procedures and systematically monitoring their effectiveness, initiating education and training programs for all individuals involved in sport on harassment-free sport, and embedding democratic leadership styles to mitigate abuses of power. Following two reports by Black and Ridge and Fasting on the problems women and children face in sport with regard to sexual harassment in 1998, and the analysis of codes of practice for preventing sexual harassment and abuse to women and children in sport in 1999, the European ministers responsible for sport adopted the resolution number 3 of 2000 on the prevention of sexual harassment and abuse of women, young people and children in sport. The Council of Europe asked their member states to commission research and collect data at national level in cooperation with national and international organizations and researchers to ascertain the scale and importance of this problem in sport in their countries, and to prepare a national policy. Today, a number of EU member states still have not prepared for or have not adopted a national policy against harassment in sport, nor researched the phenomenon. In 2003, the EU Parliament resolution on women and sports urged its member states and sports federations to adopt measures for the prevention and elimination of sexual harassment and abuse in sport by enforcing legislation on sexual harassment at work, informing athletes and their parents of the risk of abuse and the means of legal action available to them, offering specific training to the staff of organizations, of sports organizations, and ensuring that criminal and disciplinary provisions are applied. In 2005, a recommendation on discrimination against women and girls in sport was passed by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, who called for combating sexual abuse in relation to sport. In 2010, the Council of Europe initiated the campaign 1 in 5, aiming at stopping sexual violence against children. In 2007, the EU Parliament further urged its members to define best practices against sexual harassment and abuse in the sports domain, and to adopt measures for prevention and control, and to organize educational campaigns. In addition, the European Commission published the White Paper on Sport, where it recognizes the need for protecting the moral and physical integrity of young people through the dissemination of information on existing legislation, establishment of minimum standards, and the exchange of best practices. In 2005, in the same year, the International Olympic Committee adopted a consensus statement on sexual harassment and abuse in sport, suggesting several practical steps to improve athlete safety by providing guidelines for prevention and resolution. The Olympic Committee recommendations once again promoted actions such as the development, monitoring, and evaluation of policies and procedures for the prevention of sexual harassment and abuse in sport, the development of education and training programs, the nurturing of strong partnerships with parents and caregivers in order to prevent the phenomenon. Also in 2007, the United Nations published its first report on women, gender equality and sport. This report focuses on violence against women, exploitation and sexual harassment, and recommends that there should be commitment to creating safe, supportive environments for women and girls to participate in sport, and that initiatives must address a number of key issues such as gender stereotyping, power relationships between coaches and athletes, as well as the link between international sporting events and prostitution, and the risk of human trafficking to fill that demand. In 2010, UNICEF published the review document Protecting Children from Violence in Sport, which revealed the absence of research data and knowledge and the necessity to establish structures for eliminating violence in sport. The document provides recommendations for minimizing the risk of sexual harassment and abuse of children in sport. Among these recommendations, some prevention initiatives can be applied to child athletes and others to both children and adults. There is a strong emphasis on the need for research. Accordingly, prevention policy should be based on reliable evidence, since without an evidence-based framework, policies may be based on myths, stereotypes, and a lack of awareness, and may be simply ignored. This document presents specific areas where further research is needed, such as the diverse forms of physical and emotional abuse of children in sport, the prevalence, forms and impact of violence in sports worldwide, and experience gathered in societies outside the current research base. Overall, the recommendations for the prevention of sexual and gender harassment and abuse set forth by various international bodies and organizations are generated towards two main courses of action. The first course of action is prevention, and the other one is action. Prevention and action. The actions endorsed for the prevention of this phenomenon cover areas of delivery and dissemination of research that will supplement knowledge, deepen our understanding, and improve our methods of intervention. Development of codes of ethical behaviors for all involved parties, education and training of all involved parties, coaches, staff, athletes, parents, and development of action plans and adoptions of policies against sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports. For the control of the phenomenon, the proposed actions endorse establishment of specific procedures that will support and protect all involved parties, monitoring of sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports, and rigorous evaluation of all measures in effect. Of course, in spite of all these above-mentioned efforts to promote safe sporting environments across European Union and the member states of the Council of Europe, not all member states have acknowledged the necessity to act upon these recommendations. And in order to make a difference in the European sporting environment, these recommendations need to be endorsed at all levels. At all levels, we mean at international, national, and local level. And the sports community must acknowledge that if the potential benefits of sports are to be realized by participants, there must be a collaboration between agencies responsible for sport, for development, and those which are responsible for the child protection and for equal rights. Without effective partnerships for knowledge generation and sharing of best practices, change will be haphazard and limited, and perpetrators in sport will continue exhibiting inappropriate behaviors, and many children, women, men will continue experience harassment and abuse within the sport environment. Within a 20-year historical perspective, media coverage of cases of abuse in sport appears to have played an important role for attracting attention to the problem. In Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, sexual violence and abuse within sport became a significant public issue during the 1990s, when the national media provided extensive coverage of cases of child sexual abuse in sporting contexts. Such cases led to outpourings of moral panic, which then became the catalyst for a change. In the UK, there was intense media coverage of the Paul Hickson case from 1993 until his eventual conviction in 1995. Hickson, an Olympic swimming coach, was sentenced to 17 years in prison for rape and sexual assaults against female teenage swimmers in his care. Following the Hickson case and much advocacy work, a child protection in sport task force was convened in 1999, which led to the establishment of the Child Protection in Sport Unit in 2001. This unit works with key stakeholders throughout sport to minimize the risk of children being abused within the sporting context. In Germany, the topic became public when a severe case of child abuse was reported in the German media in 1995. Karel Farr, a successful figure skating coach, was sentenced by court for 11 cases of sexual abuse and 2 cases of bodily injury against his female skaters. Farr was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He was fined approximately 13,000 euros and banned, of course, from coaching for 3 years. In 1995, the former teacher, scout leader, and sports coach Jackie Keismertz admitted to systematically sexually abusing children in France over more than 30 years. His activities were uncovered after one of his former victims killed himself. Some 72 male victims aged 8 to 15 years were identified. 60 complaints reached the court, resulting in 20 years imprisonment. A few years later, in 2007, French sports organizations commissioned research and policy work after 2 high-profile abuse cases. One involved the hammer thrower, Catherine Moyon, who reported being a victim of sexual violence from coaches and other athletes during training. And then Isabelle Demongeau, a former high-ranking tennis player, claimed to have suffered several years of repeated rape by her coach while still a minor. In the Netherlands, a high-profile case was reported in 1996. There, a group of 3 elite female judokas officially accused their coach, Peter Oms, of sexual abuse. He had guided all of them to the Olympic Games. Although these complaints did not differ from earlier complaints voiced in public, the response of both the sports federation and the public was stronger than ever. In this case, the coach was condemned for his abuse, fired, prosecuted by law. This incident motivated the Netherlands Olympic Committee and Netherlands Sports Confederation, the largest sports confederation in the Netherlands, to start a project against sexual harassment and abuse in sport. This project had 2 main goals. The first one was to develop a structure that assists sports federations in case of an actual incident, and second, to develop a prevention program for eliminating the permissive sports culture that seemed partially responsible for incidents like the Oms case. In Denmark, an HIV-positive martial art coach caused extreme media headlines in 1998 when it became clear that one of 11 systematically abused boys had been contaminated. The coach was sentenced to 4 years imprisonment. The national sports organizations distanced themselves from this case, highlighting that the coach had been operating a non-profit sports club with no formal affiliation to them. Nevertheless, this case gave impulse to sports organizations to prevent convicted perpetrators from entering sport by introducing criminal record checks. The above examples illustrate how high-profile media coverage can contribute to the problem of sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports by becoming a public issue and facilitating changes at a national level. It also suggests, however, that in some countries, despite high-profile cases of abuse and international calls for action, significant efforts are yet to be made in order to address these problems of sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports and translate sport-specific resolutions into concrete policy actions. Although different European countries are at different stages of development regarding the prevention of sexual and gender harassment, and abuse in sports, they can all learn from each other's experiences. As illustrated, media coverage can be an important trigger for subsequent action concerning high-profile cases. When cases of abuse are highlighted, awareness amongst politicians, key stakeholders, and the public can provide the context which encourages changes that can help prevent future cases. At the same time, the tendency to publish only extreme cases can contribute to a perception that sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports are rare and extreme events. Media coverage of cases which fall at all stages of the continuum of sexual and gender harassment and abuse needs to be encouraged in order to facilitate a holistic approach. Research conducted in Europe can help countries share and compare findings to highlight similarities and differences. In countries where no research of sexual and gender harassment and abuse has taken place yet, there is scope for exploratory and descriptive research to define and clarify the extent of the problem. Countries that have built upon such work and conducted prevalence studies can begin to undertake more advanced research in order to analyze the factors that promote and prevent sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports. This will facilitate the further development and implementation and evaluation of interventions. Exchanging research results across Europe also increases potential to employ a more diverse range of methodological approaches such as case analysis, ethnography, systematic observation, experimentation. Of course, there are differences. Although differences exist in approaches to prevent sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports in several European countries, highlighting the key elements of the applied strategies could guide developments in other countries. For example, one common denominator that has been identified is the need for clear structures, clear policies and procedures regarding sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports. This can be facilitated by defining clear action plans, including prevention measures. For example, criminal record checks, educational programs, codes of conduct, or managing allegations, which means clear reporting procedures and mechanism for supporting the victim and the alleged perpetrator, and managing the case post-judgment. For example, sanctioning the individual and learning from the case so that the experience can feed into future preventive methods. Research and systematic evaluations are also required in order to evaluate the efficacy and effectiveness of all these key elements. The lack of relevant structures for the prevention of sexual and gender harassment and abuse in sports continues to be a limiting factor in a number of European countries. And of course, this can be a chance to let the things go beyond and find ways to combat sexual harassment, as is the aim and scope of this program, of the Erasmus program. It is it is challenging, and an unusual number of youth sport sexual harassment and abuse cases all around the world have received media attention. And these cases may involve both girls and boys as victims, and covered they may cover a wide spectrum of inappropriate behaviors exhibited by male or female coaches, ranging from sexual harassment to rape of multiple minors by coaches. The coverage that these cases have received means that we need not to forget these incidents and move further beyond in order to combat sexual harassment. Sport has long been adopted by politicians, educators and parents as a suitable vehicle for the development of healthy lifestyles, self-discipline, citizenship, personal morality. It has held a special place in the affections of Western industrial societies for its supposed virtues and its potentials as a tool of economic and social development. The special status of sport has also protected it from critical scrutiny and meant that social inequalities of other problems such as sexual harassment and abuse have all too often been ignored or tacitly condemned. The social problem of sexual exploitation in sport has been constructed differently at different times by different stakeholders with different agendas. It was brought to prominence by media coverage of a number of high-profile scandals involving Olympic and other elite-level coaches. Since this exposure, there has been widespread panic amongst sports professionals in the UK and some parents of young athletes about the need to keep sexually exploitative coaches out of sport. Perpetrators of sexual abuse are depicted as monsters and beasts. Othering or scapegoating them in this way is then used to justify overlooking the social conditions which give rise to their sexual deviance in the first place. Research on institutional sex offending has been much slower to develop than individual pathological analysis. There is reason to be optimistic that sport research might eventually contribute to wider understanding of institutional abuse, but for that to happen, there needs to be a concerted effort by both sport and non-sport researchers to share their work more often and more openly. No doubt, sport researchers share these experiences with their counterparts in academic and professional fields. It may even be the case that they are better placed than other groups to advance the research which aims aims at a scope larger than a closely connected group, and that there will be practitioners who share interests in order to combat the problem of sexual harassment in sports. Because the majority of research on sexual abuse outside sport has been conducted on intrafamilial abuse, including physical, sexual, emotional, and neglect, since this is the site of highest incidence. But for sport, there has been it has taken longer to admit that there is that truly there is a problem, and there were various forms of denial expressed this was as a kind of defense. In the case of sport, denial of sexual abuse arises from a characteristic set of beliefs about sports, that sports are a morally pure category of behavior, that fair play is a concept applicable to children players rather than coaches, that sport is a site of justifiable male privilege over females, and that in the main sports organization, sport organizations are apolitical, and they should remain so, and that sexual matters in sport are a taboo that we should not talk about. So once some specific incidents have started gaining media coverage, these beliefs have started to change, and today we can talk more openly about the issue of sexual harassment, and to be more ready than ever to implement strategies that can protect children, athletes who are in the realm of sports, who live in the world of sports, to protect themselves for such behaviors. Thank you very much for watching.